I want to thank Gil for having invited me to this conference and giving me another opportunity to meet my colleagues, my dear colleagues on the Faculty of Media and Communication, and also to be in Belgrade, which is usually a pleasant adventure. Now becoming apparently not so pleasant, but well, I take Nada's slogan for mine, let's show our solidarity by doing what we know to do best, even though I wonder if our best is good enough. So, in my presentation, I will try to present a croquis, a sketch of a theory of ideology. Why this can be important? It's important for two main reasons. A theory of ideology has political consequences. If we take, let's take two paradigmatic theories of the 20th century, which also mark the horizon of the communist movement in the 20th century, Lukács' and Gramsci's theory of ideology. They both had political consequences. Lukács' theory is an elegant one. The distance of the class from the center of social structure, and the center is contradiction because Lukács at that time was Hegelian. This distance determines the distance between the possible and the really existing class consciousness of a social group. So it's a nice theory. However, it has problems where Lukács doesn't see it, and that is the proletarian consciousness, which should work more or less automatically according to the Hegelian Lukács' scheme. What we end up with politically with Lukács' theory is the Bolshevik strategy of introduction of consciousness into proletariat, which means we end up with Leninist politics and the Bolshevik party, which we have seen historically was a failure, a dramatic and tragic failure. So if we take Gramscian theory of hegemony, again, it's an elegant it's an elegant and fantastic, fascinating theory. But it was used by the Italian Communist Party as an alibi not to enter governmental structures for a long time. When the moment came that they decided to nevertheless enter into into the practical parliamentary policy, not to be in opposition with Enrico Berlinguer, the compromesso storico, the historical compromise in favor of communism. That was the beginning of the end of this, in the past, a very strong party. Now, if we look very summarily, we can say that Lukács' blind spot was the absence of a theory we would now call the theory of ideological interpellation. He could not, at that point, at the time of history and class consciousness, explain why proletarian individuals would vote for extreme right or for Nazi parties. So what was insufficient is, what was the blind spot of his theory was what we would now call, with Althusser, a theory of ideological interpellation. If we look back into Berlinguer's politics, we can see that he underestimated what we would now call the material existence of ideology in parliamentary institutions. So effectively, we can say that Althusser's theory of ideology, or better, Althusser's intuitions, proposed in his most quoted article, Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, answers these two theoretical flaws in the Marxism of the 20th century, and also gives a chance to develop a theory that could explain or describe in more precise terms the relationship between theoretical practice and political practice, or theoretical practices and political practices. So let me shortly give a summary of what would be my presentation if there was time, but I will nevertheless give you the gist of my proposal for a theory and demonstrate it on concrete historical examples. Now, Jasna Koteska gave me an opportunity to start very simply and to present my theory in very simple and still adequate terms. As you remember, she was recalling Freud's early theory of hysteria, which was that hysterical symptom blocks a contradiction between two mutually exclusive actions which are desired by the subject, by the individual. So if we recall that for Aristotle, an action is the conclusion of practical syllogism, then we can write what Jasna was describing us. I hope I will be able to make it work. So we can describe this Freud's, yeah, I need some more. I need some more space. No, because I already. It doesn't matter. I can write it here. So we can describe in Aristotelian terms Freudian theory that Jasna was sketching to us in this way: a practical syllogism. Sorry. So this is major premise. This is minor premise, and the act is conclusion. Now, the problem with hysteria is that we have another syllogistic chain, major premise prim, minor premise prim, and conclusion prim. The two conclusions are mutually exclusive. So what does the symptom how the symptom intervenes? The symptom breaks into this contradiction, into this mutually exclusive action, and blocks it by making it irrelevant. If you cannot walk, then the dilemma between staying at home and curing the father and going to a dance is irrelevant because you are staying at home anyway. So, if this is Aristotle's logic, my theory can be summarized in Aristotelian rhetorics, which means not syllogisms but antonyms, not rigid and severe logical deductions, but floppy but interpolating rhetorical mechanisms. So let me see if we can, let's say, maybe this color. The scheme I will be using is actually is Aristotelian, but I will use the interpretation of Aristotelian rhetorics in the version of Oswald de Croo, French linguist, who developed a theory of argumentation in language. Now, my ambition is to develop a theory of the ideological mechanisms, which of course is not a theory on the level of the language, but on the level of speech, of practical speech, which means we are embarking in this ambiguous and probably impossible project of linguistique de la parole, as Saussure would say. But still, it's worth trying. My idea would be that an argument leads to a conclusion, and in order for this argument to reach the conclusion, you need a third element, which in Aristotelian tradition is called a topos. Or topos, I put small a, not to be too scholarly. So it links together, the topos links together the argument and the conclusion. Like, the weather is fine, let's walk to Karadjordjeva. That was Gil's proposition a couple of days ago. And the topos, which binds together the argument and the conclusion, is when the weather is fine, the walk is pleasant. Or maybe another topos would be when the weather is fine, Karadjordjeva is a nice place. So we see that you have this kind of fluid rhetorical situation where you can smuggle as the binding element, as the binding component, various topoi, various linking elements. And my idea is that this is the ideological component, and that in most cases the ideological component that brings together the argument and the conclusion will be lacking, but will nevertheless be understood and interpreted in the right way. Why? Because the argument, which I conceive not as a topos but as a piece of discourse in Martinian style of another discourse to which this evident discourse is referring, but it's not explicit, because this discourse is one of the dominant ideologies. So now we have to move on. Yeah, maybe this. No. Yeah, okay, thank you. So I'm learning, technology, and I will not make it this. Okay, this is my first example. It's a real historical example from the leading Ljubljana daily. It was written at the occasion of elections in Serbia, and it says, although Serbs are inclined to authoritarian government, it will depend upon the opposition and the civil society whether Serbia will become authoritarian or not. Now, of course, my attention was first, of course, attracted to the obviously chauvinist component of this utterance. But after looking at it, it's not so simple. The evident element is not so important. What is important is the non-spoken link that connects the although phrase to the conclusion. Namely, it doesn't follow that although Serbs are authoritarian nation, it will depend on your position. There is something lacking, huh? So, what is although? Although is well, it's a concessive conjunction in classical grammatics, but it figures in utterances like, although the weather is fine, I will not go for a walk, or although I studied a lot, I failed the exam, which means although signals that the conclusion that will be drawn will oppose the conclusion we expect in ideological terms. The conclusion we expect is, if the weather is fine, let's go for a walk. I studied a lot, therefore I succeeded at the exam. Although tells you that although A is an argument for conclusion C, what will come in the following what follows is the negation of C. So such an although construction relies upon, hinges upon the expectation and the general acception, the ideological domination of the beliefs that if I study a lot, I pass the exam, which is factually not necessary, both ways. And of course, I may be prevented to go for a walk for many reasons, for instance, because I have to study for the exam. So if we try to fill in the whole argumentation of the Delo utterance, we should put in this, what is in italics here. Although Serbs are inclined to authoritarian government, the attitude of the body politic or the electoral body, I use this archaic phrase because it's nice, the attitude of the electoral body will not affect the final political outcome, whatever the result of elections. And then, again, it will depend on the opposition and civil society. Civil society means NGOs and this kind of institutions, whether Serbia will become authoritarian. So what you see is that behind this argument, there is an ideology that after the elections, the voters have nothing to say, which is one of the possible ideologies and especially one of the possible practices of parliamentarian bourgeois democracy. So, so this is a little more, let's say, academic articulation, which, and what is important here is that actually the construction of this, ideological mechanism is this. Argument, Serbs as a curious nation, then the negation of conclusion. The attitude of the body politics will not affect the final political outcome. The negation of conclusion is the argument for the next argumentational chain, which brings the conclusion. It will depend on the position. And the funny thing is that this part, which is the essential part of the argument, is missing. But of course, most of us accept as obvious and self-evident that voters have nothing to say after the elections, and we understand without this part being explicitly spoken out. Now, of course, if we do that, if we take it for granted that voters have nothing to say after the elections, we are reproducing a certain type of dominant ideology. We are reproducing a certain type of practices. And we are making this ideology dominant, even though it goes against our interests. So the next time, when you have an easy interpretation, stop and ask yourself whether it's really as self-evident as it appears. So easy understanding is dangerous. Okay, let's go to the next. So yeah, this is what I've written. Now here is another example which is more complicated. In rhetorics it would be called polyenthemy, because you have a whole chain of arguments whose conclusions are the next arguments for next conclusions. It was an interview in Deno, again, by Roman Sporluk, who is a known theorist of nationalism and Central Eastern Europe. So he comments a Russian annexation of Crimea and says, without Crimea, Ukraine probably has even a better chance to become a reformed democratic state. It will be more pro-European since it's lost so much pro-Russian population. So this is a kind of electoral mechanics, but still, it's an argument, but an argument where certain connecting links are missing. And you see, if we reconstruct the whole argument, we see that what is missing are those utterances in italics. Ukraine lost a lot pro-Russian population, therefore it will be less pro-Russian. I mean, it's not evident that if you that people who are speaking Russian or people who are ethnically declaring themselves as Russian will support any regime that is actually in power in Russia. So it will be more pro-European, is spelled out. Ukraine will be more pro-European, and therefore it will be more democratic. Again, a very important equation. Pro-European is pro-democratic. And I mean, yeah, okay. So Ukraine will be more pro-democratic, therefore it has better chance to become a reformed democracy. You see that what is lacking in the argument, the non-explicit articulating elements, are the equations, are the opposition pro-Russian, pro-European, exactly the semantic interpretation of the situation into which European Union pushed Ukraine before the crisis. It's either or. And next, pro-European equation means democratic. So, okay, this is no joke, but let's look at this. This is a historical example again. It was pronounced by Slovene Prime Minister at that time, Drnovšek, who was making propaganda for his politics. And this statement was so outrageous that the person who made the interview the next day wrote a long commentary about with the point that if he has no better argument for his policy, well, and so I mean it's self-evident. Huh? We all know what it means. It means that you don't have a choice. If the choice is between Balkans and Europe, it means the only option you have is Europe, isn't it? But the analysis is difficult because it's a little bit different type of argumentation, because here it's only the argument, the premise, which is spelled out. And you have to make the whole reasoning to come to the right conclusion, the only possible actual conclusion, which is you only can choose Europe. Okay, so here is the formula would be this. The argument is spelled out, so it's in bold, and this is left to the interpreter, to the reader, to the audience to fill in. Aha! Now we come to theory, and my next example is taken from Corneille, from his preface to the second edition of his tragedy, so-called tragedy, because it's not a real tragedy, it has a happy ending, Le Cid. You know, the Cid is a historical tragedy. You can see the heroes of this tragedy in Seville nowadays, in the crypt. They are buried there. I mean, that's, you know, people who are making historical tragedies are buried there. They are real. So, but the interesting thing is, well, you know, I'm bringing water to the sea, but I should comment on classical French tragedy anyway. You know, that you know that you have Racine, the tragic dilemma that is insoluble, and because there's no hysterical symptom, people end up tragically. Phaedra, who has to choose between loyalty to her husband, which is not bourgeois loyalty, but the whole city depends on her as the queen being faithful to the king and Theseus. And of course, it's not about Thebes; it's about French absolute monarchy. So, and then she has to choose between loyalty to her husband or loyalty to her love, and she is nothing by her love for Hippolytus. So, and it ends up tragically. Now, Le Cid is a beautiful feudal drama with a monarchical conclusion, and it's the drama of two lovers, and the father of Jimena, of the lady, offends the father of Don Rodrigo and Le Cid. So father of Don Rodrigo says, well, now I'm too old to go to the duel, but you have to revenge me. And as a good son, Don Rodrigo goes and kills Jimena's father in the duel. Now, the real tragic dilemma is Jimenez. What to do, whether to hire a professional killer, which are most feudals anyway, a professional killer to kill her love, or to be faithful to her love, which means to herself. It's well, you know, it's an unsolvable dilemma, because in Levi-Strauss's terms, it's a dilemma between consanguinity and affinity, between possible marriage alliance and dynastic lineage, and both elements are necessary to compose structure of kinship structure de parenté, which is essential in feudal society. So, so it is a tragic dilemma, but then, I mean, Rodrigo is good enough at skirmish, so it ends happily. But what is interesting is the comment, the way how Corneille starts his preface to the second edition of the tragedy. And he says, I found this motive in a Spanish chronicle. Then he quotes in Spanish. And then he comments, those who understand Spanish will remark two circumstances, two components. One is that Himen, who could not prevent herself to love, to recognize and to love the beautiful qualities that she saw in Don Rodrigo, even though he has killed her father, that Chimène, it's, you know, this classical French, long periods. So Chimène went to propose herself to the monarch, to the king, this generous alternative. Now that's my problem. What the hell is generous alternative? And the generous alternative is either he gives Don Rodrigo to her as a husband, or he punishes Don Rodrigo according to the law. So the generous alternative is, well, you decide whether you're going to kill this guy or giving him to me as a husband. So it's bizarre, huh? And then the other circumstance is that the king decided to marry them, and that the marriage was, and that everybody was happy with this marriage. So, of course, we can see what was the king's reasoning, the monarch's reasoning. The monarch's reasoning was something like, we here have the beginning of a vendetta. So, a vendetta is something harmful for the social cohesion, as the European Union says nowadays. It's destroying social cohesion. So we have to stop it. Then another argument for the king is, we are here having a female without coverage. She lost her father, which means her master. Now her king will rush and try to grab her, because in feudal society marriages are the elementary way how to make politics. So again, we have a conflict here. The best thing to do is to stop vendetta, to put this uncovered female under another coverage or mastership, which is to marry her to Don Rodrigo. So that was the reasoning of the monarch, probably. And everybody was happy. Now, my problem was still why this alternative is generous. And, sorry. I finally came to this solution. We shouldn't be fascinated by the contents of the dilemma, but by the formal construction. And we assume that Corneille, in his historical situation, which is the building up of administrative monarchy, of the monarch as absolute sovereign power, that she reasoned in this way: I have a choice, it's impossible. But us having a choice, I am free. As I am free, I can delegate my choice to the monarch, which is Hobbes in practical individual life. It's Hobbes' alienation of freedom in practical reasoning. So Corneille probably was fascinated by this. Something we cannot understand nowadays, but it's political. It means how to construe the monarchical power, which of course was the question of Corneille's time. And Corneille, as a good opportunist, was looking for the ways how to ideologically support the absolute monarchy. Racine who was, according to Goldman, a Pascalian thinker, was more skeptical. Didn't see the outcome as happy as Corneille did. So, Why I'm taking this example? Because it's an example at the beginning of individualistic modern era. And it's taken from a time where freedom was not self-evident. And so it's the beginning of our situation. And it can give us the key to this utterance, which for Rancière is an utterance of political subjectivation. And this is the point of my present theory, that we should distinguish between two types of interpellation. One is those we were working on before. I would call it interpellation by identification, which relies upon quasi-lexical semantic components of items that are occurring in sentences. And quasi-lexical meaning is, of course, a meaning inspired by dominant ideology or ideologies, because I believe there are many. And then it's not subjectivation, it's just following the course, it's just following the mainstream. It means it's reproducing the domination of dominating ideology and the status quo in the social construction. And then what Rancière calls politically subjectivating breaks this automatism and is semantically problematic if we rely upon the quasi-lexical meaning of the units. But then we don't believe that a language exists, and we don't believe that the dictionary is universal and eternal. We believe that the sign is the arena of the class struggle, as Voloshinov says, of the Bakhtin school. So here we have the struggle about what German Jew means. So the empirical circumstances of this slogan are confused and unclear. And you will find a short description of them in a footnote in my paper. Nevertheless, it's probably a response to Marché, the Secretary General or Organizational Secretary at that time of the Communist Party of France, who wrote an article in L'Humanité, on the official daily of the party, saying that the movement of 22nd March is led by a German anarchist. And of course, if a French communist says this, you have German and anarchist. Germans, hereditary enemies of French people. Anarchists, hereditary enemies of communists. You know, from Marx, Bakunin debate on, it's really, every real communist reading this knows that this is something not only bad, but doubly bad. So,
time is already gone. So
okay, look.
I will give you just a digest version.
No, I'm going. I have everything is So the lacking element is therefore is led by a false revolutionary. The movement is led by a false revolutionary. Therefore, and then this is written again in L'Humanité. It is a false revolutionary movement going against the interests of the working masses, etc. You know, it's a Marché made a nice, good Stalinist article where he trying to discredit the student movement. Now, students translated this out of the idiolect of communists into another idiolect everybody understands, German Jew, so not German anarchist. So, however, that's my interpretation. We are all the leaders of our movement. Therefore, we are all German Jews. And the paradoxical feature of such a construction is that you have to treat German Jew both as a neutral lexical entry, because you are giving it a different meaning with context, But on the other hand, it has no real meaning if you don't refer it to the phantomatic utterance. The movement is led by a German Jew. So I wanted to show this one. This one is it's also real. It's full of ideology. That's another Ljubljana daily. It's during the first Greek crisis. It says, well, you have these nice slogans here. Peoples of Europe, rise up. You have the title of the article, Greeks on the barricades, Euro is falling. I mean, and then protests rise, doubts whether Athens will be able to fulfill the promises. Signs of crisis also in some other members, EU members, so it's great. But the best is here. The protesters who resist, who oppose austerity measures of the Greek government, yesterday morning developed great slogans on the Athens Acropolis. However, the police did not intervene. So, you know, we again have an implicit suggestion that a police intervention would be expected and normal. So this is the analysis. Therefore, police should have intervened. However, police not intervene. And then, now, what is important is that there is a different interpretation of the slogan, "We are all German Jews," that was offered by Cohn-Bendit, who is the German anarchist and Jew in history, to whom Marshall was referring, and students too. He gave this interpretation in '98, the 30th anniversary of 68 events. And he says, well, it's because they identified with excluded or marginalized groups. And this became a scheme for other slogans. It translates identification of one part of the young people with those who are at the margin of society. And this interpretation is exactly in the spirit of the 90s, when the class conflict is replaced by identity strife. According to Cohn-Bendit, we should analyze it like a German Jew is leading, this is phantom state who is leading the movement, therefore a marginalized person. As we identify with the marginalized, we are all German Jews. And so we have Shemen, we have students according to Cohn-Bendit, and we have students according to our interpretation, which I think is more in the spirit of 68, direct democracy and this sort. So what is interesting is that Shemen and Cohn-Bendit interpretation are formally very close, analogous, which means that we are again close. I mean, the way ideology works now is analogous or similar to the way ideology worked in 17th century at the beginning, which means we are probably at the end of modernity. Well, no, this, no. This maybe we will treat in the discussion or some later time. But I will still, end up with this quotation from the 18th Primaire, because it is a literary and very well formulated statement of the same theory, which I didn't develop, theory about relationship between theoretical practice and political practice in labor movement. Thank you.